All right. So welcome back to Shoot Me Straight with Eddie and Dave. Today we have an awesome guest, Kevin Laliberte.
That's right.
There we go. Yeah.
Yep.
We connected over the phone, I think, was it 2 weeks ago,
Yep.
around that?
Yep.
And you run a pretty awesome nonprofit, the Surf Brigade, here locally.
Yep.
I actually had heard about what you were doing through Ethan Fisher.
Yep.
He was just giving me some input on it a while back. And so, yeah, it's awesome that we finally got to connect, and I'm glad to have you on here.
Yeah, man. Ethan's our volunteer chief of operations for Surf Brigade.
Nice.
Critical teammate.
He's such a phenomenal dude, man.
That's
I
right.
love being around him.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me today, and,
Yeah, buddy.
and everyone for getting us going.
Yeah, so
Good to
give
be
us a little bit of background. I don't know any of your story at all.
As Eddie mentioned, Kevin Laliberte. I live here in Santa Rosa Beach also now permanently. But I grew up in New Jersey, suburbs right outside of New York City. Good place to grow up, probably as good as any other. But wanted to
Say some of the toughest people come out of Jersey.
out of Jersey.
Yeah, I was born in Patterson.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
I was just north of that in Washington Township,
Okay.
by Westwood. Yep.
Nice.
But I know Patterson real well. But I wanted to get out of there, and so my ticket out of there was the military, and joined the Air Force right out of high school, 18 years old.
What drove you to go join the Air Force?
I did not have any strong military mentor at that time, like guiding me through the different services, truthfully. Looked at the Army, looked at the Air Force. I was probably mostly agnostic to branch at that time, honestly.
Not a lot of knowledge on.
Yeah, I didn't have like a strong, veteran family member who could explain the differences to me, but landed in the Air Force. Went through training. My first base, as we were just talking about earlier, was in Japan, which was super cool. Loved that. I was 18 to 20 years old there. And then I went stayed in PACAF or Pacific, right over to Korea. I did a year there.
Where at in Korea?
Osan.
Okay. Yeah,
Air
I've been
Base.
there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that was cool too. I was there 2000 to 2001, so I was 21 years old there. And I was I was at Osan in Korea on 9/11. It was actually, middle of the night over there. We were off base. It was midnight curfew.
What year did you join?
98.
98. Okay. All right.
And at midnight the MPs would walk around town and tell everybody it's curfew. It's time to go back to base. And that night it was like 11, and they were telling everyone to go back to base. And we were all pissy about it. We said, "Oh man, we got another hour," and nobody knew what was going on. They thought what they had told us was North Korea is attacking South Korea right now. Everybody needs to get back to base, which is like the worst thing you can hear when you're stationed in Korea.
Yeah.
Right? And so we all ran back to base in the middle of the night, and everyone had been drinking, and somebody had the TV on, and we went, "Oh shit, this is what's actually happening."
It was like mayhem, huh?
Yep.
Pretty much. I remember, because I was in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina at the time when 9/11 happened on the rifle range. And, I was in the butts pulling targets, and they were like, hey, plane had crashed in. And sort of everybody was sort of paused, like, what? Like,
Yeah, it didn't
and
make
then
sense.
it's like another plane, and then it went into we're getting attacked. And it was like a mad dash run back to the barracks. Nobody knew anything except, I think, typical military knee-jerk reaction was we're all getting attacked.
Yeah, right.
Get back. Yeah, so I remember that feeling.
Yeah, in fact, before somebody turned the TV on and figured out what was going on, the entire base thought we were being attacked.
Yeah.
And so people were like getting their chem suits out and putting those on, it was nuts, man. But at the time I happened to be, I think all the services probably have a similar program, but I was in my retraining window where, 3 years in, if you want to change jobs, you can. It's like your first opportunity to change jobs. And so I did, and I became a TAC-P, which is Tactical Air Control Party. At the time, we were ETACs. You probably remember that. Before It was JTAC. And so I finished up my time in Korea, PCS to what was Fort Benning, Georgia. Went through the TACP pipeline, and then and my timing was right. I was like a young E4. I got ETAC certified, and right off the bat, I was assigned to 3rd Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade at Fort Benning, and we invaded Iraq by then. A couple of years had gone by, so it was 2003 by then. And as you remember, the Marines went east, the 3rd Infantry Division, 3rd Brigade went west, and that was sort of my baptism by fire, right? As a young ETAC, and it was awesome, man. I mean, I was a young dude, lived in the desert in Kuwait for months, waiting for that, final call. It was this time of year, actually, March.
What's an ETAC?
Yeah, so we got to make sure the listeners understand.
Yeah, so ETAC, at the time, that was Enlisted Terminal Attack Controller. It later became JTAC, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, but you're a ground forward air controller, and so you coordinate airstrikes with all aircraft from all the different branches in close proximity to friendly forces, close air support.
Okay. So basically, Dave, they get attached to combat units, infantry units, special operations, whatever. And so if you're out on an operation and something goes awry, and like you might be in a firefight that might be overwhelming to the group that you're in, the JTAC or ETAC at the time would go ahead and talk to the planes and be like, hey, we need you to drop on this location where the enemy are. And so they control the airspace above us.
Gotcha.
And are able to drop bombs.
Yeah, so you'd be attached to like an infantry or like a SEALs team or some.
That's exactly
and then
right.
you would be the one that calls it in.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And I'll tell you more about that. But as you in more elite units, you're more integrated with the teams as well.
Okay.
And so as that occurs, typically you're able to control airstrikes a lot closer to you as well when you're the closer you are to the enemy forces. And so, you can read about some really incredible airstrikes that have happened with some really heroic guys that have served in our time. And they're meters from their location.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
But at the time, for me, I as a young guy, I drove a Humvee from Kuwait to Baghdad, and we fought our way up there with conventional army forces at the time, and it was a really unique experience to be part of an invasion. That may only happen like once in our lifetime for each of us.
This is early 2000s?
Yeah, 2003.
Okay.
And so we got to Baghdad, we held it for a while, and then after a few months, that's when we started the deployments, which nobody knew how long those were going to go on for. And as it turned out, it was a really long fucking time. But, I was there for the first one. And when I went back from that initial deployment, I was just super juiced up, man. I wanted more of it. I wanted to be better at everything I could do. And Fort Benning was a perfect place to be if you were a TAC-P, because that's home to Army training. All the Army schools are there. And so I was a young guy. I was like 23 years old. I was an E4. And I just started looking around at all the high-speed guys. And one of them, who I'm still friends with today, he was a little older than me. He was one rank higher than me. He had been to airborne school, Ranger school. He had all these qualifications, and I just grabbed on his pocket and said, how can I be better at everything I do? And so he, told me how to get more training, more schools, and then the real ticket to being in a great organization as a TAC-P, also on Fort Benning, is the 75th Ranger Regiment.
Yeah.
And so I made it clear that that's the direction I wanted to go to. And at the time, the assessments were a little looser than they are now. But in a short amount of time, I worked my way over to be assigned to the 3rd Ranger Battalion in the 75th Ranger Regiment at Fort Benning. And that was the place to be if you were TAC-P at the time, because in the years that followed that, 2004, 5, 6, 7, the Rangers were manning the task force that was fighting across Iraq and Afghanistan. So
yeah, there's a lot of work.
A lot of work to be done, and it was great to be a part of it. And so the years that followed, when I say me, this was everybody who was in that era with me. But, we were doing we were deploying every single year. You deploy for 4 months, you'd come home for 8 months. And when you were home in that 8 months, man, you were training for 5 or 6 of those. So you weren't really home.
Yeah.
But it was a really interesting experience. And we'll talk about this more when we get into Surf Brigade and the rhythm that it builds in your life. But it's probably we all took for granted at the time that it's not normal to before you even come home from a deployment, you already know when you're going back on your next deployment.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're living in these like micro timelines. You're like, man, I'm going to get back on this date. I've got leave for 10 days and then the training begins and then I'm right out the door.
It's very structured.
It's very structured. It has to be to maintain that for any length of time, but it has an impact on you later in life as well if you're not careful about that. But so I was with the Ranger Battalion, deployed in 2005, 6, and 7, and to all the great hot spots. I mean, I was in Ramadi for the summer of 2005 and then the summer of 2006, and that was right after the Marines had the notorious battle in Fallujah and kind of flushed all the guys down in Ramadi.
Yep.
And so, man, that was like probably the most formidable years of my life. We were talking about young men stuff earlier, 25, 26 years old, running 100 missions in 3 months, just back to back. And it was awesome. Wow. It was the place to be, especially if you're a JTAC,
Oh, you're getting all sorts of work.
And by the time, to go back to, originally it was ETAC because the Air Force, for the most part, without going into all the details, was the only service that had ETACs. But because the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had such a high demand for terminal attack controllers, all of the services were creating them. And so you had Navy SEALs getting JTAC certified. You had Army Rangers getting JTAC certified. You still had your TACPs in the Air Force and combat controllers as well. But we were all doing it together.
Was the J, is that stand for like joint?
Joint.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So
when all the services do it, it's joint.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yep.
And then when you say like airborne division, and then there's a battalion under the division, is that correct?
Yeah. Well, in the case of the Rangers, you have a Ranger regiment, and then beneath that you have your Ranger battalions.
Okay.
And there's 3 infantry battalions in a Ranger regiment. Now they have some more support and intelligence and a variety of other functions as well. But
it would be similar to, you're part of the teams,
yep.
but then you're this SEAL Team 3 or 7.
It's yeah. I mean, the nomenclature is different and the names, but it's all sort of similar based. Yeah. So like, if you are, I would say like regiment. So you're in the SEAL teams. It would be you're on the West Coast teams. You're under group. So we have groups. So you have Group 1 and Group 2. Mm-hmm. So Group 1 is the West Coast teams, and then you're like, yes, I'm part of Group 1, but I'm at SEAL Team 1, and then under SEAL Team 1, there's multiple platoons.
Yep. Similar size organization.
Yeah. Just how they organize it.
Yeah.
Got it.
But those were good times, and one more deployment to Afghanistan there, which is mostly unremarkable.
What year was that?
That would have been probably 04. Yeah, 04. Winter time. Yeah. Super fucking cold, man. These places are probably not there anymore, but, deploying to Oregon E, which was awesome. I love that place if you've ever been there. It's just in the mountains of Afghanistan, but, good, hard, a good deployment doing really hard things, probably not as rewarding as like combat in Ramadi is if you're with a direct action force, but just good, hard character defining work. But then those 2 deployments in Ramadi, when it was all said and done, I did almost all of the fighting in my career was in those 2 deployments. It was summertime. All the bad guys were there, and you had the task force there, and we were just going out and kicking beehives, and it was good.
Let me ask this: when you're in as a JTAC,
yeah,
are there some guys that they go through training and all that stuff, but when it actually comes to war and combat, that they like freeze up? That has to be. When you're calling in airstrikes, and your location has to be pretty precise and right on, and like there's a chance that you could strike one of your guys.
Yeah.
Like, are there some guys that just freeze up? And
I think there could be, but probably just as likely as guys who would freeze up doing anything else.
Yeah.
You know, that's a character problem.
Are they
That's not
weeded out?
a training problem. Ideally, you know, the thing about special operations is you go through several assessments. And so the likelihood of that occurring is very low, especially in the more elite units. I have seen that in one case, without going into the details, of a guy who in a firefight just absolutely cowered down and froze. And he was released from the organization later because of that. Because it creates an immense amount of risk for everyone else who's in that life or death situation fighting. If even one guy is not doing what he's supposed to when you train to it, and that can create a lot of risk to the organization. Mm-hmm. But, you know, what I'll tell you about that is when you're a JTAC, it's like any other attached specialty. You have to know how to do everything else that everyone else on the team is doing. And when you're an Air Force guy attached, you might be the only Air Force guy on a mission with an entire platoon of Rangers. You have to know how to do everything that every other Ranger on that objective is doing. And then you have to know how to be a JTAC as well.
So you still have to know, like, the medical
Yep,
stuff, like
all of
first aid?
Yep, all of it. You know, you're not going to get into the detail. You have other specialties on the objective. You got your demo guys, you got your snipers. You're not trying to do all of that, but you have to know how to move, shoot, and communicate to the same standards as everyone else.
Gotcha. You're pretty much anybody in special operations is a multi-tool, right? You need to be able to do and perform every job that's expected of you, but the reality is you are not going to be able to perform each specialty to the level of excellence as if that's your only job, right? So even as shooters, we are expected to be able to be JTACs. If for some reason the JTAC goes down, we're like, hey, we have to call it in. And, you know, I remember I had to do it once. You get on there, you're like, I am not a certified JTAC.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the pilot automatically knows, all right, I'm talking to a dummy, so I need to be able to help him.
He's going to pull everything he needs out of you.
Yeah, he's going to ask you the questions that normally a JTAC would provide.
Yeah.
You know, without thinking, right?
Yep.
So, and it's the same premise for, like, if a JTAC gets attached to us. Yes, do we want him to know how to operate everything we do? But we're also not expecting him, like, oh, you better know this to a T. We're always, they're usually going to have somebody there with him if he does, like, make a mistake. Like, hey, dude, nope, don't do this, right?
Yep.
It's
You know, to answer your question completely, though, and as it turns out, I've reflected on this in the years since. This what I went through at that time has become a part of. It became a part of my career later as a senior military leader, and even now as a civilian as well. But I expected that I was going to fail at everything I did. I just assumed it's the mindset I had, the preparation and readiness mindset. I assumed everything was always going to go wrong at the absolute wrong time, right? I assumed that my GPS was going to stop working right when an aircraft needed coordinates, and so I always had a backup. I assumed that my radio was going to overheat in Iraq and it was going to stop transmitting, and so I always had a second one. I just assumed that everything was always going to go wrong all the time, and I would drill this in my own head on what I was going to do when that happened. And as a result of that, nothing bad ever happened. You know, lots of little things did happen, but I was always ready to react to it because I had a plan for it.
You were prepared.
I was prepared. And to that point in Ramadi, I had some other great JTACs who were there with me as well. And we were fighting so much and we were dropping so many bombs at that time. Like when a commander would ask, you know, if we were taking fire from an adjacent building and the commander said, I want that building to go away, in his head, he wants it to go away like in the next 7 to 10 seconds, right? But it could take 7 to 10 minutes just to pass the necessary information for an airstrike, and then you're going to wait even longer for the bombs to come off the rails, right? That's a really long time when you're in a firefight. And so how do you speed that up? How do you speed up that information flow, right? And so, we sat down the JTACs that were in Ramadi at the time. There were 500 numbered buildings. Intelligence told us there's 500 buildings in this city, and we have the coordinates and elevations for all of them. And we made a book of 9 lines. 9 line is what you pass to the aircraft. And we made, it was a book with 500 9 lines in it. And we sent that book to every pilot who was flying in Iraq at the time and told them, if you're flying in support of the task force in Ramadi, have that book on you. And so what we were able to do is if the commander said, drop that building, we could look at our GRG, our maps, and go, that's building 17. Turn to page 17, tell the pilots, open your book to page 17. Read back the elevation and the coordinates. That's your target. And we just sped everything up, right?
Wow. That's awesome.
And so our reaction time was getting better, which meant we were prosecuting more targets and we were going out more often.
Hopefully saving more lives.
Yeah, saving
people
lives.
In a firefight.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, every second matters.
Absolutely. And just everybody was getting better at everything they were doing. That's another thing that, we talk about in Surf Brigade. Like some people call it flow state. There's, different ways of explaining it in different parts of life. But sometimes we might not realize when we're at our prime. Like sometimes it takes other people to tell you. And I don't think any of us are really good about that, but I did have some good mentors when I was coming back from those deployments because we were fighting so much and I was as a JTAC, we were getting into it. And all these little processes. I had some older guys who kind of pulled me aside and said, hey, you should think about going down the reconnaissance path. And same thing in the Navy. That's kind of where your senior guys go. Your really experienced guys go down to reconnaissance organizations and intelligence organizations and do other things. And so to move it forward after my few years with the Ranger Battalion, I made the transition over and supported the again within the Ranger Regiment, but the reconnaissance company. And then I did 3 more years and 3 more deployments with the reconnaissance company, and it was a totally different type of work. And so, it was not direct action. We were not kicking down doors anymore and finding bad guys, but we were doing some like green face tactical recce, sitting in the woods for a week watching an objective before the direct action force would come up. Doing a lot of, military free fall and overland infiltration and exfil as well. And then doing some high end, sneaky stuff also.
Yeah. You would, for instance, sit in the woods, like observe like a building or like some guy, and like you said for weeks sometimes?
Yeah. So like a classic tactical recce example would be like 7-man team, and you're 1 Air Force guy, so you're with 6 Army Rangers and then 1 Air Force guy, and we would do a 25,000 foot hey-ho in at night to an offset drop zone, and then which is probably 10 or 12 miles away from the actual objective, and then you would walk in with all your gear that you're going to use for the entire time you're there, so you're heavy as can be. And then when you get there, it's typically overlooking an objective that is going to be assaulted, a week later. So it could be an airfield that's being seized. It could be a house that there's a target in that they're going to come and get. But we would go and provide intelligence and photos and videos of it so that when the assault force came, they knew what they were going to see when they got there.
Yeah. So basically they would go in, Dave, and set up what we called a hide site.
Yep.
So you have like a 7-man team. You go in there, you set up a hide site, which provides cover and concealment, hopefully, and you're living out of that hide site for the next 6 to 7 days. Yep. And you have everything from all your laptops, pictures, your tons of cameras. So you're taking pictures of the objective, reporting any movement, any patterns of life. Like all of that. So basically you are an ISR platform, but it's humans on the ground. And you're reporting everything back so that when they do go do a hit on that target, they have everything hopefully that they need before they go actually do it.
So would then they call in, they would come back to like a SEALs team or Delta Force or something, and they'd come in, they'd say, hey, here's all the information that you need to know about this.
Yeah.
And then they hit the target.
Yeah.
But
there's a back door on this side.
Yep,
There's
that's
like
exactly
all
right.
That stuff.
Yeah.
And when you're a recce team, when you think you're badass, by the way, the whole time you're there, you're like, man, I could take this target down right now. But your job is not to fight.
It's not to engage.
You're not set up for that. You're not coming in with heavy weapons. You're not coming in because you got a ton of gear as it is. You're humping in, a massive amount of intelligence equipment, cameras, computers, like Eddie said, satellite dishes, all of this shit, right? And you've been there for a week. And so by the time they hit the target, like you think, man, I could hit this. But the guys that are hitting it, like, man, they slept 8 hours last night. They had a good meal. They're all pumped up. These guys just greased their guns. You've been in the field drinking puddle water for a week, right? Yeah. And so, it takes a little bit of discipline to remember, like, man, when they hit the target, stay in your hide site and you wait until they call exfil, and then you fall in on they know you're there. Yeah. And you don't move when they're hitting the target. But you're not the guys that are hitting it.
No.
And it's tough sometimes because if you're a recce guy for a couple of years, like you start to miss it, and you always hope, you're like, man, I hope they call me forward and they need another door kicker. But the reality is you have to have the discipline and remember, like, man, when you've been out there, every day you're out there, you get ground down a little more.
Oh, yeah.
You're sleeping on the ground. You're drinking fucking puddle water. You're eating shit MREs. You're not really sleeping the whole time. You're pulling, reconnaissance patrols the entire time. Like, just the environment in general, it grinds you down. And by the end of the week, man, you're like not as sharp.
You're ready to get the hell out of there.
You're ready to get out of there.
Yeah.
But, you have to remember and tell yourself, like, man, even though I'm feeling good, because it's exciting when a target's getting hit. You're like, man, I got my blood's pumping. But you have to remind yourself, like, man, I'm not as sharp as I was 7 days ago when I came out here,
Yeah, the guys coming in are
they're fresh.
They're fresh, And, but again, that's a different type of work, but it's an incredible amount of responsibility you have when you're on a recce team. I talked to guys about it that I was on the team with now, and I bring up, like, man, jumping out of a plane at 25,000 feet in the middle of the night, when it's the plane's blacked out, the jumpers are blacked out, you're just looking through a pair of NVGs. Like, at the time, none of us would say it, but I've said it in the years since. I'm like, hey, was anyone else nervous when we were doing that? Because at the time, if you said it, people would just go, you fucking pussy. No, right? But now we're all retired and we're like, oh, dude, that was crazy. That shit was nuts, man. But it doesn't just happen. Everybody on that team has hundreds of jumps leading up to that, years of training, and it all culminates in this one, event that it's a very short amount of time when you exit the aircraft and you get to the ground. But you have so much gear, and I'm a lighter dude. Like, I'm 175 pounds, which meant when we were jumping that I had to jump all the heavy shit, because if you weigh like 250 pounds, because everybody has the same max on the parachute, 360 pounds at the time. It's probably changed a little now, and the chutes have gotten better. But the heavy guys would jump less equipment than the lighter guys.
Well, usually the lighter guys are at the tail end of the jump too, pulling the cords down, risers, trying to catch up to everybody else. Yeah.
And but that was all good, and we did a couple good deployments there in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Did you have times where you were just like sitting there, either on reconnaissance or in Ramadi, where you're just like, this is bad, like, I can't believe I get to do this cool stuff, like it's G.I. Joe stuff?
I don't know. In hindsight, I don't know if I ever took the time to think that, because even when I was in recce, I just always assumed I was going to fuck everything up all the time, and I never wanted to be that guy, because you never hear the end of it. When you get to a recce team, you're hearing the stories about the guy 10 years ago that forgot his extra socks, like those things never die. No. And so, you're just constantly at that time thinking about, how can I be better all the time? I don't think, the other thing I never did to that point, like, none of us took pictures.
Yeah, same.
We never took the time to take pictures, and I'm like, man, like we have all the retire guys now, we've exchanged pictures, but man, it's a handful. And I'm like, dude, we spent years of our lives together, like the same guys living in shitholes and doing the hardest stuff. And we have like no pictures.
I don't know how it was for you guys back then. I mean, I know like taking pictures and all that was a no.
Yeah, you wouldn't. You didn't want to get caught.
If you
with
got
them
caught,
yeah.
even with the little small like disposable ones, if you got caught taking pictures or like, hey, we're having fun, it was like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Like, put that away. There's none of that, right? And it has, and you also, and I know that feeling you're talking about, like, it's almost like you have imposter syndrome 24/7. You're like, dude, I don't belong here, and I have to earn my way here every single day. So you're never able to like sort of pull your head out of that, of what's going on, and enjoy like, hey, this is actually pretty badass. You're so worried about messing up and earning your spot.
Yep.
And that's how it was for me as well. You know, and I look back on it now and I'm like, dude, I wish I would have taken more pictures. 'Cause later on in the war, you know, my last deployment was 2017. I mean, it was all these new guys, they're taking pictures of everything. Yeah. It's like completely flipped.
And those guys are not that much younger, but in the military, you live in dog years.
Yeah.
I mean, guys who are 5 years younger than you, it's like a totally different generation, you know? The one thing that I wish I had some really great mentors, but I wish, and I tried to do this like when I was getting towards retirement, I wish someone had like grabbed me by the collar and just told me like, right now, you are as good as you're ever going to get. This is the absolute prime of your tactical career right here. Enjoy it. Like nobody pointed that out to me. And so I just kept my nose on the grindstone the entire time.
Yeah.
But
how come you wish someone told you that? Just so that you would stop?
Yeah, it's just so I would appreciate it. I would probably savor the moment a little more.
Yeah, take the pressure off yourself a little bit.
Yep. But I tried to do that like when I was in my final tactical assignment leading out a squadron. Like I would grab those E6s and E7s and I would just sit them down and tell them like, dude, you've done 8 deployments in the last 7 years. Like you're a war hero. Like right now, this is as good as you're ever going to get. And I'm not telling you to stop training. I'm just telling you, take a minute, breathe it in and enjoy it. Because later on in your life, you're going to be an old dude on a podcast looking back at what you did, you know? But, you know, and the other thing about recce too, like you're always training as if you're going to get rolled up.
Yep.
You always think my 7-man team is going to get compromised and we're going to get taken prisoner and we're going to have to negotiate our way out of that. And so the way you pack your kit is totally different too. Like nothing has your name on it. And when you're a JTAC, you try not to carry anything. Everybody tries not to carry anything that gives any information away. You don't want them to know what service you're in. You don't want them to know what your specialty is. When you're a JTAC, that's really hard. You know, how do you carry all these tools that are specifically designed for conducting close air support and then later act as if you don't have a specialty, right? And so there's trade-offs, but one of the things that I use as a talking point sometimes now, I think it applies in other areas of life. When you're recce, you live out of your ruck. You jump your ruck in, you carry your ruck. That your ruck is everything to you. Everything you have goes in there. And you know, we had a packing list on the team. Everybody has a packing list. What goes in it? Once you hit the packing list, you can typically carry what you want after that. But that's a sort of pick your poison thing, because if you're humping that ruck, you got nobody to blame for what's in it except for yourself, right? And I remember I've always been a why guy. You know, when I was young, I had a lot of supervisors who would tell me, stop asking why all the time. And as it turns out, I think that's actually a pretty good approach. And it was never disrespectful or undermining. It was just, I always wanted to know why we were doing things. And so even when I would get a packing list as a young recce guy, I would ask questions and say, why is this on the packing list? Are there any alternatives? And typically it was, no, and you're the Air Force guy. Shut the fuck up and carry it, right?
Yeah.
But I had to carry it, man, for years. And so, you know, I was on a deployment. It was really slow. We weren't running missions. And there was like this postal scale at the FOB we were living on. We were in Skin at the time. I don't know if you've ever been there. I loved it. Mm-hmm. It was a tiny little OGA base. And I took the time. I had my packing list, and we would lay everything out before you went on a mission so that everybody, if you were compromised, they would know what you had on you at the time that you were compromised to determine like how long you could survive based on what you had. And so I started weighing everything. And at first I was like weighing the computer and everything, and I'd finish, and then I had a couple more days and I'd go back and I'd break the computer apart and weigh the battery and weigh the computer separately. And then I started breaking the radios apart, and I was weighing every single individual antenna. And so eventually I could tell you how much an FM antenna weighed. I could tell you how much a UHF antenna weighed. I could tell you how much one 5.56 round weighed and how much one 7.62 round weighed. Every single item. And so when we would get a packing list, and I kind of nerded out and built this Excel sheet with it, I would punch the packing list in, down to how many rounds of ammunition I was carrying, and I could tell you exactly down to the ounce how much my ruck weighed, right? And what that did for me was it made me a lot more accountable of what was going in my ruck, because if you put a ruck on, everybody who puts a ruck on, they go, God, this thing is heavy, man,
yeah.
right? Like you always think that when you put it on, and then it goes away and your shoulders go numb, and eventually you stop thinking about how bad it sucks. But the thing is, if you ask a guy, if a guy puts his ruck on and says, man, this thing is heavy, this sucks, and you go, well, could you add a little more to it? He'll probably go, if he's a good teammate, he'll probably go, yeah, dude, just throw it in there, okay? But he'll never ask you, what are you putting in there? How much does it weigh? Because he doesn't even know how much his ruck weighs. He just knows it's fucking heavy, man.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is it's actually a liability, right? Because if that guy later on in the mission can't carry his ruck, and you go, dude, did you even know how much your ruck weighed? Do you even know how much you can carry? Like back then, the answers were typically no. The answer is I carry everything that needs to be carried, right? But I got a little smarter about it and started to figure out, because we were doing enough recce that I'm like, man, I know I can carry a 110-pound ruck for 12 miles without stopping, and like I'll be okay. But you turn that up to 118 pounds, like that actually makes a difference. It's going to be hard for me to keep up with the team on that. And so when I got it down to ounces, what I realized was most of us were carrying extra shit that we didn't need to be carrying because there were other options, right? Little things like antennas, like maybe you sacrifice a little bit of bandwidth but carry a multi-band antenna, and now you're not carrying 2 ounces equal pounds.
Yep, that's it right there. Ounces equal pounds.
And so I still have this today, actually. I have actual photographs. I did take a few I laid out in my little room. You know, I had my little like 2x4 bed in the corner. I had every single item on the floor, and I took a picture of it, and I have a list of how much every single item weighs, okay? Now, the reason why that's important, and this ties into Surf Brigade as well, is like, man, even today, everything, I have like this rucksack mentality on everything I do. Like my schedule, I think about it like a rucksack, okay? My weekends with my family, I think about it like a rucksack. I need to be aware of exactly what is in it all the time because it's mine. I'm carrying it on my back, right? When you're on a recce patrol, nobody sneaks up on you and puts things in your rucksack without you knowing. That's your fucking rucksack. You know everything that's in there, right? And so, man, I carry that. I carry that schedule. I carry my family. I carry myself through the business world, right? And I carry that rucksack. And so I have to know everything that's in it. On my schedule, I need to know down to the minute what's happening, just like I knew down to the ounce what I was carrying. And what that allows me to do is make better decisions. When someone says, can you carry this? Instead of just saying yes, I go, well, how much does it weigh?
Yeah.
Why am I carrying it? Okay. If somebody says, can you add this on your schedule? I say, why am I doing it? How many minutes is it going to take? And then I need to look at my packing list, my calendar, and decide if I can squeeze it in there, right? And so even today, years later, like those experiences on the recce team, so formidable. They made me so accountable, literally down to the ounce. I wouldn't trade them for anything. I love it, man.
That's a great analogy.
But as it goes, eventually you get promoted and you come off the line. And so after those years At this point, I had all these things we talked about, you know, the evasion, Ranger Battalion years, Ranger Reconnaissance years. I then went into an instructor position for a couple years, which is pretty common back then for guys to kind of catch a break.
Take a knee.
Yep. And I came down here to Florida. I was at Hurlburt Field. And I was teaching in a squadron where all the combat controllers and pararescues and TACPs were going through. And, you know, teaching all the fun stuff, free fall, dirt bikes, machine guns. It was like, because that's what I had just got done doing, you know.
Wait a minute, now, dirt bikes and machine guns?
It was awesome, man. Yeah. But teaching all the young guys how they were going to go out and do it, right? And at the time, met my wife at Hurlburt Field. She was in the Air Force at the time also. And, you know, we that later got married, and we have 2 kids now. And, you know, we're great. And it's, you know, it's funny. She's a doll. And I remember her telling me when we were like first married, she was in the big Air Force. She got out after a couple of years. She would tell me, man, you're crazy. You know that, like, you are actually a little fucked in the head. And I wasn't like sure how to receive that at the time. I was like, I don't know what to say. Like, thanks. I guess like you're right, probably. Yeah. But after being married for several years, and she was around like all my teammates and the guys who I was like in Ramadi with and the guys I was on the recce team with, you know, years later, when we were talking, she said, you know, I've actually determined that all of your friends are crazy too. You are actually all crazy. You just convince yourselves that you're normal because you live in this little isolated bubble where as long as you're with each other, everything seems normal. But like, I go out in public with you guys and the other wives do too. And like, you're not normal. Like the other people around you, you don't interact with them the way other people do. And again, at the time I was like, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that. Like, I'm perfectly okay with what you're saying now. But that, and it's because of the experiences, you know, when you're in the military, you do hard things and you do hard things with teammates, and that creates bonds. But that also ties into Surf Brigade, which we'll talk about, here in a bit. So
you relate with that, Eddie?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same spiel I've gotten from Andrea and any team wife, you know, we're different. Yep. And at the time, you're like, no, and I would always deny it. I'd be like, no, I'm not different. Like, I don't understand what you're talking about. But I think, the more now I looking back, and even now, like how I conduct myself or the people I hang out with, like, yes, I do hang out with a certain type of individual where I can be myself, right? Because the way I've seen it since I got out, and I think I know where you might be going with this, but like, you do have to learn to sort of conform or be around other civilians, right? And you sort of have to like, okay, I'm not normal, but I'm going to try and normalize myself a little bit. Yep. But at the same, I feel like when I do that, I'm not being myself. I'm doing that for a purpose. But then when I'm around my teammates and everybody else, I'm like, nope, this is who I am. Like, you know.
It's like you adopt some social norms.
Yes.
To like,
you have to.
You have to.
You know, but
you have to. I mean, you can't. You have to, but you also have to remember that, you know, we'll talk about this as we go into the military transition piece. Like, you should also not try to pretend that you're somebody who you're not. Yep. Okay. I
feel like that leads you into a bad path.
Bad place. You know, I want to come back to that more in a few minutes, but that's where risk is really found. Like, we are all crazy, actually, not just military people. Like, I'm just at the point in my life where I'm like, everyone's crazy, man. Okay. Like, embrace it. If you pretend you're not, then I know you really are, right? Because you won't even say it. You won't even admit that you are. But if there's any real dissonance between like who you actually are and who you present yourself as, that's called narrative, which is one of the pillars of Surf Brigade. That's where risk is found. You know, when you talk about like suicide across the veteran community, this applies to civilians as well, but I'll only talk about veterans as it pertains to my experience. Most veterans, if you dug into why they made that terminal decision, it was because there was a lack of genuine narrative. Like they were projecting something other than what was actually true, and either other people called them on it and they were so embarrassed they thought they would never recover from it, or they maybe didn't realize that, and in the moment that they finally did, they couldn't accept it, right? And so it's important to be comfortable with who you are, man. I know that's easy to say, but you know, to the point earlier, to bring it back around, like, man, that's what I did in my 20s and my 30s. Like, that's who I was. Like, I spent my 20s fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, so, you know, I wasn't working at Wells Fargo, like running a bank machine for those years. And so I'm not going to be what some other guys might be, right? I didn't go straight into college and become a businessman, and now in my 40s I'm doing other, like, that's not the path I was on. Yeah. But it doesn't mean the path I was on wasn't great. It was, but it made me fucking crazy. But I'm okay with that, yeah. Right? But to bring it, to summarize it, I did instructor for a couple years, and then I went back to Fort Benning again, and this time I was in a leadership position in the same squadron that I kind of grew up in. Mm-hmm. And so I was serving at the regimental level on the fire support team. And so I was then advising the commander on like strategic fire support and
more in like the jock.
Yeah, working in the jock, yeah. And really primarily maintaining a ready force. And so making sure all the young guys, you know, the young Kevins that were kicking out the door to Ramadi and to do recce, like making sure they were all ready and they had everything they need to go do the things that I used to do.
Did you find fulfillment in that? Like
absolutely.
Being that mentor?
Yeah. That emotionally was probably the hardest job I had, because I knew those guys were going to do the things that I had done. And so I knew exactly what they were doing. You know, when a guy would, you know, put in his paperwork for, you know, approval to go do a particular training event, like I had done those training events. So I knew the hardest thing for me to do at the time, which was a good learning experience. This is not uncommon with like young military leaders. I just had to trust everyone to do what they knew how to do. I had to stop asking them a million questions. You know, I had to stop asking guys, how many ounces does your rucksack weigh? Because they hadn't learned that lesson on their own yet.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my position to teach them that. Okay. And so, you know, if I asked a young stud, like, hey dude, how heavy is your ruck? And he go, heavy, but I got this. I go, I know you got it, man. Move out. Right. It was hard for me to like just accept that, man, they had to learn their lessons on their own. You know, if it was grossly unsafe, I'd step in and say, all right, you don't see this coming, but I'm going to tell you what happens next, and this is why we're not doing it that way, okay? Yeah. But everything else, you got to let them learn. And that was really a formidable time for me as a leader to learn how to trust subordinates, you know.
Did you have, because at that time, because, you know, I know you're in that leadership position in the jock and you're watching other guys go out, was it also challenging, like, I want to be going out too? Did you still have that, like, I want to be out there getting it, or did you accept the fact, like, this is where I'm at, and I'm good?
I did, and I even thought at first, I thought back when I was a young guy, and I'm like, man, I can remember going out on like airborne operations, and I had the old timers asking me questions, and I would think like, man, this guy hadn't jumped out of a plane in 10 years. Why is he asking me anything? And so my idea for myself as a young leader was, I'm going to maintain all my currencies on everything all the time, and I'm going to lead. Because then I'll be relevant to everybody all the time. But as it turns out, man, you can't do that, because if you spend all your time on the range and you spend all your time deploying, like, you're not, as much as I hate to say it, you're not in the staff meeting.
Well, you lose sight of the big picture.
Yeah, you lose situational awareness. That's right.
It's the same premise, you know, like when you're a TAC lead and you're going to clear a structure or whatever. Yep. Usually as the TAC lead, when you're going internal, but you are trying not to clear rooms, right? Yep. So you're sort of in the house dictating movement, or not really dictating, but controlling it where you need to. And then if you find yourself, and I would do this all the time, I'd end up clearing rooms, and then you clear one room, and now you're clearing 2 rooms, and now you're clearing 3 rooms. Guess what? You just lost the whole big picture. Now you don't know what's going on in the house. So it's the same premise. I imagine, if you sit there and try and keep up with all of your qualifications, I'm going to go to the range. Now I'm going to go jump with the guys. Now I'm going to do this. Well, your actual job is suffering, because they're like, well, do you even know what's been going on the past 2 weeks while you've been out training with the boys? No.
Yep. And it takes discipline. It sounds ironic, but it takes discipline to not do that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Like if you look in most military organizations, right, and I was enlisted the whole time, like you have 1 E9, you have 1 E8, but you might have 5 E7s and 25 E6s and 50 E5s. And so if you're in that E9, E8 position, like who else, how many guys can do that job? No, the answer is 1. But how many guys can do the job of an E6? The answer is 25. And so if you're spending your time trying to do their job, man, who's doing yours?
100%. I mean, that relates with corporate,
absolutely,
with business world too.
Absolutely.
I mean, as I can code, right? I can go in there and do it myself, but I need to let go of that.
That's right.
Let someone else.
That's right.
Because that's not, other people can do that.
Yep.
And that's the hard part, is stepping back and going, other people can do this. They're in their place.
And trusting them to do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Even though they may not do it as good as you do it.
Yep.
But.
Or your way.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
I did that for a few years, though. Probably the honor of my career there was serving in that. To be a leader in a combat organization where you fought in combat, like that's as good as it gets. And so after that, I went to headquarters at Air Force Special Operations Command. I was a E9 by then, so I was managing assignments for everybody. A little challenging to be in such an administrative role for me after having a real combat-centric career. I did have some really great officer leaders. I punched out on a good deployment where I was the senior enlisted leader for a special operations aviation unit. We maintained all the aircraft across Africa and supported all the special operations organizations on that continent. Real strategic, great. I loved that, but then came back to headquarters again. And as it goes in any service, if you stay in long enough, they kind of pull you out of your career field to lead at higher levels. And so in my final assignment, I went out to Colorado, and at almost the same time that I arrived there, and you guys will remember this was in 2020, the Space Force broke off of the Air Force. And so the billets, the manpower positions for those, I was in one of those at the time. And so they pulled 19 E9s out of the Air Force and said, you're now standing up the Space Force. And I was one of those guys. And so for the next, it was kind of unexpected, but it was cool and historic as well. And so my last 2 years, that was my final assignment, was the first 2 years of the Space Force, and I helped stand that up.
What is the mission of the Space Force? Because
to win wars in space.
Is that for real?
Yeah.
Like, okay, because I get asked all the time, and I'm like, dude, I don't know, man.
A lot of people confuse the Space Force with Space Com, right? Yeah. Space Com is a combatant command. Space Force is a service. But what we have to remember is space is a domain, just like Earth is, or like cyber is. And so we fight wars in domains, and we have combatant commands that do that as well. And so we fight wars in space. Space Com fights wars in space. The primary service provider to Space Com is the Space Force. Okay.
Got it.
Just like the Navy fights wars at sea, the primary service provider, INDOPACOM fights wars in seas, right? The Navy doesn't fight wars. The primary service provider to INDOPACOM is the Navy.
Yep.
Okay.
So Space Force is the platform or the supporting role or the supporting force for
Space Comm,
which is the
with
combat
fights. Yep.
Okay.
So the Space Force provides people, it provides equipment, it provides policies, tactics, all of that.
So
But it's not the only.
like,
It's not the only service. The Army fights in space, like other services do as well. But primarily the Space Force, just like the Navy provides the majority of maritime warfighting capabilities for a commander. There are some other services that provide some, but primarily the Navy. Right? Same thing in space.
So did you have to go through like a bunch of classified stuff at that point?
yeah.
Where you got
Everything in space is classified. And you can read about this. It's not classified, but there is a tendency to overclassify a lot of stuff in space. That's a historic problem. But the reality is a lot of stuff in space, just by nature of it, because a lot of these are very exquisite capabilities. Like there might only be one unit that does a particular thing in space. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, like that entire unit could be a SAP, a special access program, right? Mm-hmm. Like nobody can know what that unit actually does, because if they do, then that capability in space is then known. And some of these capabilities, once you do them, nobody knows that you can do it until you do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But once you do, everyone knows that you can do it. Okay. And that everybody who has a space program, it's not just space, that stuff happens on Earth too. Right. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things that we try to protect because we know, like, man, once you let that cat out of the bag, number one, everyone knows that you can do it. And number two, you're about to find out what they can do also.
Yeah.
Okay. We always have an idea of what our adversaries are capable of, but they protect their information and capabilities too. And so you never want to be the first one to show your cards, but man, if you have to assume like they're going to try to counter it, and then you're going to find out what they're capable of also.
Wow. So your last 2 years, you went from
literally the Ramadi on the front line, sitting on buildings in gunfights to space.
Yeah. Wow.
But what I'll tell you is this, back to like, the mindset. It's all mindset. Like I'm not a space guy. And so every day I would wake up and ask myself, what the hell is a TAC P doing in the Space Force? Okay. And as it is now, like no TAC P will ever go into the Space Force again. I just happened to be one of the E9s in one of those positions and got pulled over to stand it up. Okay. It'll never happen again. But because of that, like I wanted to make sure that I could do the job the best possible, down to the ounce. Okay. And so I would ask the commander every day, who was a space officer, like, sir, tell me exactly what needs to happen. And he would say, I need, 16 Guardians to deploy to this location in Africa that are capable of doing this particular mission. And I'd say, consider it done. What next? Right. And so I would identify what needs to be done and I would just do it the best I could. Right. And I gave this speech at somebody's graduation at one point. How do you know if you're doing something right? Because it's not common that somebody grabs you by the collar, like I said before, and goes, let me tell you, you're doing a good job, right? Especially when you're in leadership positions. Like nobody just knocks on your door and says, I just want to tell you you're doing really good today.
That doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
You get complaints from the IG and JAG that it lets you know people have something to say about, that happens, and I've had that.
I usually tell people, like, if nobody's saying anything to you, then you're probably doing an all right job.
Yeah.
It's the second when somebody comes up and says something to you, then there's probably a problem.
Yep, that's exactly right. But I just assumed that I was always going to mess stuff up. And so I asked questions. I went to every single briefing I could. If there was a space briefing going on, like, man, I was in it. But one of the talking points I share sometimes is there's a difference between being the first at something and being the best at something. Because everybody used to say, man, you're the first TAC P in the Space Force. And I would go, you're right. Am I the best? It's easy to be the best when there's only one. There's no comparison. Nobody can compare you to anything, right? And it kind of always got under my skin, like while I was there, because it was like how they would introduce me, and they did it because if I was getting up to speak to a crowd of 300 Guardians, they would look at me in uniform and go, this guy doesn't look like us. Where are his space wings? He's got free fall wings and a Ranger tab and a beret. You don't get that, right? And that stuff matters because they look at you and they want to see that you look like them. And so typically people would introduce me and they'd say, the best TAC-P in the Space Force, and they give a little bio and everyone would have a chuckle at it. But man, every time they did that, it like got under my skin.
Well, that's that imposter syndrome.
It's the imposter syndrome, yeah. Because I'm like, man, I'm not the best. I'm just the only one. I'm the only one, right?
I would also think this though too, because I know exactly what you're feeling. That you're like, dude, I don't want to be introduced as the best, or like it's just our nature, right? Yeah. It's like I'm trying to work, but at the same time, I think you were picked for that spot for a reason.
Yeah,
like you weren't just. Oh, there's a guy right here. It's like, no, this dude is the most qualified. And he's a hard worker.
Yep.
Probably every attribute that they wanted. But as a operator, that's hard for us to accept that I was picked because I'm actually good at what I do.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But I will tell you, when my time came to a close and I was leaving, while it's just a gesture, like it really meant a lot to me, man, because it was like it was my outbound commander's call. There's hundreds of people in the auditorium and we're saying goodbye to the chief and you got a new one coming in. And that was the first time that, it was another E9 who introduced me as the best Delta senior enlisted leader in the Space Force. Right? At the time, there's 19 E9s, but I was introduced as the best E9 in the Space Force. And it's a gesture. Like, there's no way to actually measure that, right? But what I wasn't introduced as anymore was the best TAC-P. Like, it didn't matter what my specialty was. Like, at that point, I was being introduced as a leader.
Yep.
And then I got, given some space wings, some honorary space wings on my uniform. And, like, man, that really meant a lot to me.
That's pretty badass.
It was like, dude, like sometimes you don't know, to your point, like sometimes you don't know you're doing a good job until the last day you have that job.
Yep.
And then you go, thank God I didn't fuck this up.
It's almost like it's like a funeral, right? Where when you're leaving, people then are like, dude, this is who you were the whole time. And obviously they're never going to be like, you were the biggest piece of shit. But they list all of the attributes that you have, and like you're like hearing all this, and it's very uncomfortable because you're like, dude, I've never been told this once, and I didn't want to hear it. But same thing at a funeral, like that's when people are going to say the best things about you.
Yep, right? That's right. But I found, looking back on it, and I was aware of it at the time, like fighting is fighting. If you're fighting in space or you're fighting on the ground, like you have requirements and you build capabilities around them, and you get your equipment and your formations ready to present those capabilities to commanders so that they can, address the adversary with them. And so even in space, like all of my combat experience was useful there because I was able to go back to asking why, and I would, and it was useful to me. I'll tell you something else. Actually, I would go to these space briefings and I would listen to space officers give incredibly intellectual briefings to other space officers on what was happening in space. And I would raise my hand and say, I'm really sorry to ask you this, but I'm like a dumb enlisted TAC-P and I don't understand anything you're saying. Could you repeat all of that with no acronyms and in a way that I can understand it? And they always would. It was never like Hyman and Han. They would go, Roger, Chief, no problem, and they'd do it again. But what was really remarkable, I did this in a skiff one time, in a top secret vault. There was a briefing being given, and it was a general officer at the head of the table, and she was fantastic. She's probably the only officer I would have stayed in the military to keep serving with. And she had a table full of other generals and colonels, and I was the only enlisted guy in the room. I was sitting in a corner, and the guy was giving a briefing. She's the highest ranking, so she's receiving it. And I said, hey, I'm real sorry. I'm a knuckle dragger. Like, can you say all of that again? And he looked at her, and she said, yeah, go ahead. Say it. Break it down. And he did. And later, after the briefing, I was in the hallway, like filling up my water bottle, and she was walking through, like with all her execs and entourage walking with her, and she goes, come here. She goes, hey, thanks for doing that. I haven't understood anything that guy has said in 6 months. Yep. I said, well, why don't you say that? She said, there's so many people between me and where those decisions are getting made that as long as they all understand it, it's okay. And if I ask him, it's going to lose confidence in the organization. And she said, so keep coming to those meetings and keep asking everyone to explain everything, because if I don't understand it and I'm in charge, it makes me wonder how many people below me also don't understand it, but they're not willing to say it in front of me.
They're afraid to raise their hand.
Yep.
So that's why there's no such thing as a stupid question.
Yep, that's right.
That's right. I love that. I have the same thing. It's like almost like a kindergartner. If I don't understand it at a basic level, I have to be like, hey, help me understand.
Yep.
You do it respectfully.
Yes, that's right.
But if I can't really grasp it, then man, how am I going to build upon it?
Yeah. And that we were talking about confidence before. Like, that has a lot to do with confidence. Like, I'm not a space guy.
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit in a corner and try to pretend that I'm the smartest space guy in the room. I'm confident enough, however, as a leader to say, I don't understand what you're saying. And if I don't understand what you're saying and I'm leading in this organization, that means there's risk here.
There's a problem.
And there's a problem. And my job is to mitigate risk. And so I need to understand what's happening, but even now as a civilian, you're exactly right.
Yeah.
Like, you got to have the confidence, but you got to stay ahead of that, because if you pretend to know how to do something once, man, it's harder to come back the second time and say, I got to be honest, I didn't know what I was talking about.
Well, yeah, the whole fake it till you make it only gets you so far.
Like, I'd rather just say it right off the bat. Like, I don't know what I'm doing here.
Yeah.
Okay. But I'll figure it out if you tell me why we're doing this and what needs to get done. Yeah. Right. Nobody's going to work harder than me. Yeah. Right. Nobody's going to dial things down to the minute, to the ounce, and then build it back up and be more successful. But I need to know, but I did that for a few years, and then we decided it was time to retire. And so we did, and we moved back here to Santa Rosa Beach, and now I live here with my wonderful wife and our 2 kids who are now 8 and 9 years old in the bubble.
Yeah.
That's right, but that's okay.
No, that's where you need to be.
This is a great, it's a great geographical place. Like, this is really a remarkable place, actually. I don't know if everybody actually like understands. Like, dude, we're on the Gulf of Mexico. We have dune lakes here. We have incredible state forests.
It's one of the most beautiful places in this country.
It's
like
so
this
beautiful.
little area. And we talk about it all the time. Like on pod, we're like, dude, we are beyond blessed to live in an area like this, and you can't take it for granted.
Yep, it is. And there are a lot of tourists here, but there are just enough other crazy people like me that I can get together with them and enjoy it. And so, man, we really do love it. But, tying into Surf Brigade, is that okay? Can we pivot 100%. Towards that?
Yeah, brother.
Yeah. Professionally, I do some consulting, and my wife and I own a couple of small businesses, which is good and keeps me busy. But when I retired, let me back up. When I was in space, in the Space Force, what I actually spent the majority of my time doing was solving other people's problems, OPPs. Because if they had problems, they weren't deployable. And if they weren't deployable, it didn't meet the commander's requirements, okay? And so people would come into my office and they'd say, I got a financial problem. I got a substance abuse problem. I've got a family problem. I've got all these problems. And those are really hard to solve. Like, they're really gross and dirty. Like, when you start getting into other people's lives and you're like, man, I need to help. You're an adult and I need this problem to go away so you can deploy. that's hard to do. Like it's easier to jump out of a plane and walk all night and sit in the woods for a week.
Oh yeah.
Than it is to sit down and walk someone through their problems.
Yeah.
And so I had to get good at it though, because I'm like, man, if I'm going to do this, I need to know how to do this well. And so, a couple of the tools I used at the time when people would come in and they'd say, hey, they'd knock on the door, go, hey, Chief, you got a minute? And it's never a minute, right? I'd ask them, is this a crisis? And if they said, no, it's not a crisis, often, and I could kind of tell based on personalities and like what unit they were in, and I knew what the units were going through, I'd say, come and find me at 1600. I'll be ready for you then. Because 90% of the time they'd solve their own problem. They didn't want to wait until 1600. Now I would make sure I was available and I would go and find them and I'd say, hey, I'm sorry, I was not available at the time, but it's 1600. What can I help you with? And they go, I don't know. I asked Bob. He had the answer. I'm like,
great.
Hey, great. Glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Next time, make sure Bob tells everybody so that we all have the same information, right? But sometimes people would say, this is a crisis. And I'd say, okay, come on in. Here's the thing. I can help you solve your problem or I can solve your problem for you. If I solve your problem for you, you might not like the outcome. And so tell me what you want to do here. Do you want me to help you solve it or do you want me to solve it? Okay. And there were some times where people would say, I don't know what else to do. You're in control. And I'd say, okay. And I'd pick up the phone, I'd make some calls and we'd solve problems. But if somebody said, I want you to help me solve it, I had a giant whiteboard in my office. I'd start at the top and I'd say, okay, here we go. Tell me what your problem is. And I'd write it down the top. And what I determined is very often what people would tell me their problem was actually a solution that they already came up with. They just wanted to say it out loud to get a reaction from someone else. Okay. But I knew that and I'd write it down and I'd say, tell me how we got here. And I'd write that down and tell me how we got there. And by the time we got to the bottom of the board, and I would kind of steer it because I knew where it was going. We get to the bottom of the board, I'd circle and I'd say, that's your problem. You're 15 degrees off of what your actual problem is. Okay. You probably saw this at some point. You knew it, but you allowed all these decisions to happen after it. And now we're up here. Solve this down here and everything above it goes away. A lot of people don't want to participate in that conversation at all. You ask them 2 times and they go, I'm done here. I'll go find Bob.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not interested. And once I became known for the whiteboard, like some people wouldn't come in. They're like, I don't want to go through that because it's gross.
I don't
like,
need you to expose all my shit.
Yeah. Some people don't want to talk about all their shit because you start asking questions and you ask them hard questions and they go, I don't want to talk about that. And I go, well, then we stop here and we're in the middle of the board, man. We haven't even gotten to the bottom yet. Like if you don't want to participate in this conversation, then your option goes back to me solving it for you. And you might not like that. Okay. But even when I got to the bottom of the board and I'd circle a problem and go, that's your problem. Some people still wouldn't solve it. It would remain a problem. But if they did want to solve it, at least then when I was in the military, I could say, I got a whole Rolodex of other leaders and resources that I can throw at this to help you with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the reason why that's important is when I retired, I plugged right into the veteran community. Guys I knew, and then my network of veterans started expanding to other veterans who I was meeting. And I think because of my nature, even before Surf Brigade, people had a tendency to share their problems with me. I'm kind of a problem solver. And I would ask them, like, why is that happening, man? Like, has anyone asked you that? Have you actually thought about why that's happening? Like, I'm not a counselor, but I would just ask these basic questions. And what I determined is, and these are like really good people, like successful people, the whole spectrum. It was the same problems over and over again for most veterans. When I would drill down to it, if I could actually have a conversation with them, it was the same problems. And so I started inviting guys to the beach and we did it first one right here on Grayton Beach because you can get a bonfire permit.
Yeah.
And I said, hey, I just want to invite you all out to the beach. We're going to make a fire, like hang out, man. I'm going to bring some surfboards and we're going to get in the water. And I don't give a shit if you know how to surf. Like, we're just going to do something fun together. And when everyone's there, I'm like, hey, by the way, we're all here because, like, we should all be talking, man. Like, we all have the same problems, by the way. And it was hard to get people talking, even guys who knew each other, because I think we all have a little bit of pride and nobody wants to be the first one to say, like,
we all have a wall up.
Yeah, we all have a wall up. It's easier, though, to get past that if you all make a commitment to get past it in advance. Okay? If you all say, we're going to go to the beach and we're going to talk about a specific thing while we're there, everyone comes emotionally ready to do that. But if you spring it on them and go, hey, we're all here, let's talk about our problems, people are like, wow, what?
You just ambushed me.
You just ambushed me,
Yeah.
dude. Like, emotionally, I'm not ready for this. Even tough guys, toughest guys in the world you've ever met. It's hard sometimes to go, dude, I want you to open up right now in front of people you don't know and tell me about your problems.
Yeah.
They're like,
Asking for
this is not
dudes
happening.
to be vulnerable
Yeah, it's hard.
is probably one of the toughest things, especially from our profession as well. But yeah, and then if you do it, like you said, in a setting where you're springing it on them, then they're going to go the opposite. Be like, you know what? Fuck you. You just did this. You ambushed me.
You made me uncomfortable, and I don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
But what happened after that first session is the guys that came started reaching out to me, and they're like, dude, I want to do that again. I need to hang around guys who are like me more often. And some of the feedback was really specific. They're like, dude, being around the fire on the beach at night, like, made me a little more apt to talk. And so I did it again, and I invited more guys out, and more guys came, and I started getting better feedback, and I started, like, dialing it in a little bit. And I'm like, and I started asking why. I'm like, why do people feel compelled to talk when they're around a fire? And so I started asking experts and determined, like, there are actual physiological effects of being around open flames in a controlled environment. And, like, it lowers your blood pressure. It makes you take deeper breaths, which increases your blood oxygen levels, and it creates pro-social behaviors. You do that at night where people feel a little more protected from their surroundings, like they're going to talk about stuff more. Why are people having fun together in the ocean? What is it about the ocean? I went on a frenzy of reading books about ocean therapy and surf therapy. And, there's scientific research that'll tell you why being in the salt water has a positive impact on your life. There are reputable sources that'll tell you how surfing can change your life. And so I brought all these things together and started explaining that to veterans. And I'm like, hey, this is why you feel this way on the beach. But even then still, and I started doing these in 2022, quarterly. That was my plan at the time. I said, I'm going to do these once a quarter. I'm going to invite people in. And I started telling them, like, this is why you're enjoying this on the beach. And people would say, I want to bring my family. And I'd say, bring your family, man. It's great. Veteran families connecting. But they got big. The word was spreading. And, like, dude, we had to get special events permits here in Walton County. We had 150 veterans showing up to these events. I had bonfire companies setting up the bonfire, a catering company bringing in food, a surf company bringing in boards. I had to coordinate with the county commissioner and code compliance. It was, like, huge. And the feedback that I was getting from veterans was, this is great, but I want to go deeper. I want to actually talk about deep things with other veterans, and it's really hard for me to do that when there's families everywhere.
Yeah.
And we're roasting marshmallows, and I want to go deeper. And so what I did was I identified, like, what are the challenges that veterans navigate. This is not to say every veteran has challenges, okay? But the ones that do, what is it? What is the root cause of their challenges? And when I identified those three things, I went back to my old instructor days and I wrote curriculum on how we address those. Okay. And I brought in experts and I started talking to clinical psychologists and others as well to say, like, hey, I'm not a therapist, but, like, is what I'm doing here sensible? Am I creating any risk by doing this? And really tuned it up into a usable curriculum. And then we built Surf Brigade. into a 501c3 nonprofit, which allows us to manage risk and liability and resources as well. And then took what these were quarterly events and turned them into surf therapy classes. And what that looks like now is twice a year in the spring and the fall, there is a 4-week class, and veterans sign up for it. They make a commitment to talk on the beach in advance, which makes them willingly vulnerable with others. And we tell them, hey, this is a protected space, man. Like, nobody here is going to record stuff. We don't allow family members to come. This is not a recreational event, okay? And when they come, when they make that commitment, we send them the curriculum in advance, and we meet on the beach every Saturday morning for 4 weeks in a row for 3 hours each session. And we have a 1-hour guided discussion on one of these 3 topics. And then we have a 2-hour surf session, and we provide all the surfboards, leashes, wetsuits, everything they need to surf, instruction as well. And the idea is, I'm going to tell you what we talk about in a minute, but the idea is by the time we're done, you now have a team of veterans who live in your local area, who you have something in common with. You have willingly talked about these challenging areas of your life with each other. You've made a commitment to support each other, and you have something in common, surfing, even if you're not great at it, and you have access to equipment as well. And so no veteran should feel like they don't have anything in common with anyone. They don't know who to call to go do things, right? Or that they're navigating these areas on their own. Like, we're addressing all of that head on through Surf Brigade. And the idea is building resilience across the veteran community so that nobody feels like they're isolated. Nobody is not genuine with the way they're presenting themselves. And they have battle buddies who are willing to have those hard conversations with them. Let me take a break there, though, before I tell you about the 3 things we focus on.
Well, incredible, man. We talk so much about veteran transition and veteran suicide and, like, you're addressing not being alone. Yep. And having that community around you, but you're also doing something with guys actively doing something together and then talking as you're doing it or after or before.
You have to do something together.
Yeah.
Because if I get guys together, if I meet Eddie and I go, hey, Eddie, let's go to the beach for 3 hours every Saturday for the next month, and we're just going to sit on the ground and look at each other and talk about weird stuff. It ain't happening, man. No. Like, probably not getting past the intro, okay? But we do something fun together, right? Because the military, like, a key part of developing relationships in the military is shared hardships, okay? It's all those jumps. It's all those recce. It's all that shit that you did together. And so here we're doing that in a short amount of time. I take people who have never met before, and we go out and we surf together. Man, now we're wiping out together.
Well, you're sharing those experiences.
You're sharing
together,
experiences.
And those experiences are also taking your mind off whatever hardships that you're going through, because I'm sure a lot of them that show up, it's like having a black cloud over you most of the time, where you're like, dude, but then if you get them to go do the surfing, I found it in jiu-jitsu where it's like, I go do this for an hour. My mind is completely just on this. Yep. And then once you're done doing that, you're more apt to open up and be vulnerable, be like, okay. And especially with a commune of dudes that, are similar, have the same issues, guys, you'll start talking more.
That's exactly right. And surfing, just like, any sort of combatives or even golf, there's other things that this applies to too. But the thing is, like, surfing is probably understated often. To be good at it, it takes a ton of repetitions. Mm-hmm. And if you live in a place like this where we do not have consistent surf, it can take you years to get good, right? Compared to somewhere you could surf 5 days a week. But, man, when you finally paddle into your own wave and the timing is right and you know when to pop and you get up and you turn and you're pumping down the face of a wave, like, it's so fucking exciting. And the sight picture that you have of the wave, before it's breaking, you're cruising on it. When you're done with that, the rest of the day, all you can think about is doing that over and over again. You just think about that wave. You think about the way you felt, right? It's probably like, jiu-jitsu, when you hit something you've been practicing for years and you finally hit it and you're like, oh man, you're king of the world, right? Yeah. But we want people to experience that feeling. And it probably harkens back to, like, you know, when I was in my Ramadi days, like, I didn't realize that I was in my prime, but I was, you know. We want people to feel what it's like to be in their prime and then tell them, you're in it right now, dude. That wave that you just caught, that's the one. The way you feel right now, you can keep feeling that way. But to do it, you got to keep surfing. You got to stick with it. You got to call your battle buddy. You got to get back out in the water. You got to get the reps in. And as long as you're doing that, and this is a healthy activity, that's why it's Surf Brigade, right? Man, as long as you're doing that, you're not doing a long list of other things that you could put your time and emotion into that might not be as healthy.
And you're creating momentum, right? Like
Yeah.
when you're breaking a pattern,
Yep.
right, of being stuck.
Yep.
A lot of times I imagine it's like I'm stuck. I'm not moving forward, and it's something completely outside of whatever they're going through. That momentum will change the mindset.
That's absolutely right. The three things that we focus on to that point, we focus on purpose, narrative, and community. And so each of these is a chapter in the curriculum and a guided discussion on the beach. And those are the three things that veterans who do struggle, if you could get to the bottom of the whiteboard with them, those are the three things. They have a purpose problem, they have a narrative problem, or they have a community problem, right? And the reason why these are so common, you know, and we've discussed a lot of this here today in this call, but or here in person. When you're in the military, everything you do has a purpose. Every single ounce in your rucksack, there's a reason for it, if you could get to the bottom of it. And when you lead a life for decades with that intense sense of purpose, the curse of that post-military for some veterans is that they expect everything they do to be just as purposeful.
Yep.
They expect to feel an immense sense of pride in everything they do and know, as long as I do this, I know I'm doing the right thing. And that's not the way it is for most civilians, for most veterans. You know, when you peg the purpose needle like that early in your life, in your 20s, 30s, 40s as a veteran, and then you transition out and that needle starts to come down, you really feel that void. It's civilians might never get it. They might never peg the purpose needle. Okay. I think some do. If you maybe start a business and you have an immense sense of purpose through that business and you're accomplishing good things and creating livelihoods for people, you might peg that purpose needle. But some civilians might never peg it. And so they don't know what it's like to feel that.
Yeah. That's
a blessing to experience what that's like, but it's also a curse later because when it comes down, you're well aware of it.
So interesting.
Okay. And what we try to tell veterans in these conversations is, hey, man, you're never going to get it back to where it was. Okay. Accept that.
Yeah.
But you probably will hold it somewhere in the middle, but it's probably not going to come from a single source like it did in the military anyway. It's going to come from several sources in your life. You have to go out there and find that. No one's going to knock on your door and say, hey, I got some more purpose for you. Okay. Put this in your rucksack. Okay. You have to go out and find several streams of purpose, and you got to keep them all alive and understand that all of those combined, and it takes work, it's going to get the needle right in the middle. But that's where it's going to stay the rest of your life. You're not going to do the things you did in the military. You're not going to hammer the needle like you used to. Okay. But if we don't talk about that, some guys might not even get it to the middle. It's down here bouncing on E. And they're going, man, I don't know why I'm having all these problems in my life. I'm trying all these new hobbies. I've quit 7 jobs in the last 3 years. I've moved my family around. And when we hear things like that, we know, dude, that's a purpose problem. Yeah. Like you are chasing purpose right now. Okay. And there's risks with that. You put yourself in a vulnerable position in your life like that. You're chasing.
It's the same like when we were in. You saw guys that were trying to chase combat, right?
Yep.
And I saw it later on, like 10 years into the war. You'd have guys that came in and they're like, "I want to go to combat." And, maybe they hadn't got that chance yet, and it's a roll of the dice. It's
Yep.
like sometimes you're not going to go, and it's it's out of your control. But you would see it devastate dudes
Yep.
because that was their main, purpose for joining, and they didn't get it. And I saw it when I was in. Guys were just then be at the bottom, like, what am I doing here, right? And you had to. I remember having to give talks to young guys, like, dude, combat isn't everything. It's not. Even though yes, that's what we all train to, but being the best at your job is. Yep. And you need to like stop chasing the dragon. And I was like, it'll happen. And then also be careful what you ask for. But it's as long as you just focus on your job and be the best at it, everything else will fall into place.
It'll all come.
Yeah.
That's so interesting because I've never heard a really good, and I've thought about it quite a bit since we've started the podcast over a year ago, is coming up with some framework or something that really actually helps veterans transition. The idea of, as an outsider, seeing that framework, I can see that, your purpose is so high that you're storming a building or, daily going into,
Well, it's a life or death thing too.
Right? Yeah. And the thing with purpose, the greater the sacrifice, the greater the purpose it can create. Yes. Okay. When you hit the override button in the military, this probably happens some other places, but not in these cases. Every time you hit the override button, it gives you more purpose. Okay. But you're going to pay for that later in life. Okay. So like, for example, you're raiding a house. First guy goes in the door and gets shot. And the second guy goes override, enter the house and kills the bad guy. Oh, the amount of purpose it takes to do that is unmatched. But it pushes the needle so hard, so fast that later in life, man, you just set your baseline. Okay. Yeah. I jumped a lot in the military. Okay. I'll tell you a personal experience. Like, man, one of my best friends was killed in a military freefall accident. Okay. Doing the same shit that I did, and hit the override button, bury him. You pound your crest into his casket and put him in the ground. And then you go and you jump again. Okay. A year and a half later, another friend of mine killed in free fall. You hit the override button, put your chute on, you keep jumping. Okay. But every time you do that, man, it just buries that needle. And you'll pay for it later. Okay. But if we know it's coming, that's what we tell people. Like, hey, this is not up for discussion. You're going to have a change of purpose in your life when you get out of the military. Okay. But we want to talk about it with you. We want you to figure out what your purpose is, because no one is going to do it for you. Right? There's no QRF coming for you. No one is going to walk in your house and write your purpose on the wall like you had it in your military organization, the mission statement when you walked in the front door. No one's going to do that for you. You need to do it. You need to have a proverbial mission on the wall that you're moving towards every single day. Sometimes that's micro missions. Yep. Something you're going to accomplish that day, that week, that year. But man, ain't nobody going to do it for you.
And you could even have your overall like purpose starting off. It's like, don't become a statistic.
Yeah. And
like,
it's going to change.
That's your only purpose right now.
Yep.
Don't become a statistic.
Yep.
Don't, of another veteran suicide. Let's start from there.
Yep.
And now let's start building ourselves up from that.
Yep.
But that can be because I had to have some talks with some guys as well. And I'm not like a, just like you, therapist or I just can speak from experience. And I'm like, dude, I know exactly where you're at right now.
Yeah.
And the only purpose that you should have right now, I don't care if you don't know anything, don't kill yourself.
Yep.
Like that is your purpose.
You got to have those. Sometimes a therapist isn't the right answer too, by the way. Okay. Let me tell you that. I have old teammates who have gone through hard times, and I've called them and said, are you going to kill yourself today?
Yeah.
Do I need to come over the house right now and physically intervene? You can't ask most people that. No. I can't ask my neighbor when he's outside cutting his lawn on Sunday and go, hey, Tom, are you going to kill yourself today? It would be crazy. Okay. But when you know somebody deep enough, you've been through enough shit with them, you can get right to the bottom of the board and go, listen, I understand you're going through a hard time and we're going to figure this out, but are you going to kill yourself today? A therapist is probably not going to ask that. Okay. Sometimes guys don't want to talk. We have people that reach out to us and say, I've done all the talk therapy. I've done all the medicine therapy. None of it's working. I don't know what else to do. I want to try surf therapy.
Yeah. But even in the civilian world, even then, therapy itself, because I was a therapist, even therapy itself is not the sole answer.
Yeah.
It can be part of it.
Yep.
Right. But like community is a huge part of it.
It is.
No matter what, even a veteran or a civilian,
Yep.
like community is a huge part of it.
Yep.
Purpose is a huge part
Yep.
of it. Narrative, the things you've said.
I'll move on for that purpose though. For that reason, the second pillar is narrative, and you know what a narrative is, a storyline that explains to others how you fit into society. That's what a narrative is. And when you're in the military, you have a really strong narrative. People would even, without saying anything, people would see me in uniform and say, he must be a good person. He's loyal. He loves his country. He's probably trustworthy. I'm going to buy him lunch.
Look at those space wings.
Look at those space
Heck
wings,
yeah.
right? And then if you asked me, right? And when I say me, I say I'm representing veterans.
Yes.
Okay, military members. Hey, tell me about yourself. Well, I'm in the Air Force. Tell me a little bit more about yourself. I'm a TAC-P in the Air Force, or I'm a senior enlisted leader in the Space Force. Okay. You ask my wife, tell me about your husband. He's a military man. What's your daddy do? He's in the Air Force. Okay. It's such a strong part of who you are. It's your narrative. And even in the military, like within military services and communities, there are more specific narratives. Okay. You go, hey, you're in the Navy? Yeah. What do you do in the Navy? I'm a Navy SEAL. Oh, that elicits even more narrative. Mm-hmm. People go, without knowing anything about you, they go, hard worker, never quits, trustworthy, on and on.
Yeah.
Okay. And when you look at somebody, if I look at a guy in uniform, I can look at him, right, and determine what branch is he in, what rank is he, what advanced qualifications does he have. If he's in his service dress, I can probably even tell you how many years he's been in the military, what countries he's been deployed to and stationed in. It goes on and on.
Like your narrative is literally written on
everything.
your chest.
Yeah.
You can even look at a guy and go, I can tell you what community he is in the military based on how he cuts his hair. What brand uniform is he wearing? I can peg him. Who makes his boots?
Or if he's a Navy SEAL, he doesn't cut his hair, right?
Yeah. And you know, the thing is, when you have your narrative given to you for so long, and it's easy to be really proud of it, right? Like you work fucking hard, but man, that's your narrative and you're proud of it and you display it and it elicits gratitude and it's a part of who you are. It's a part of your family. It's a part of everything. And then one day you take it off and you never had to write your own narrative. You never had to write your own storyline. And if you don't know how to do that, it can be really challenging when people ask you for the first time post-military. They go, "Hey, what's your name?" "Kevin." "What do you do?" I got the thing, and then I go to the place, and and then you're outside screaming at clouds, right? And much like purpose, if you don't know what your narrative is and you don't have confidence in it and you can't explain in a short amount of time to other people how you fit into society, it creates a lot of vulnerabilities. You're more susceptible to making bad decisions. You go looking for, which we're going to talk about, a new community to try to take on that community's narrative, right? But you have to know what your own narrative is. You have to actually write it.
I think that's what we talked about, the Honor Foundation, a little bit before we started the thing. And that's the one good thing that they did there was it was almost find your why.
Yep.
Like, why did you join the Navy? Why did you want to become a SEAL? And, you know, I think most guys will, because I wanted to be the best and I wanted to, protect my country. It's like, great. Now that we got that bullshit answer out of the way, why? Why did you choose this? And it forces guys to dig deep and be like, to think back into their childhood or like things that they went through that sort of drove them into that path. But that is, that's just like skin in the surface.
Yeah.
And that's why, what you're talking about now is getting guys together. And obviously I haven't been part of any of those conversations, but I can imagine that they do get deep enough to where it's like, yes, this is who I am as a person, not as a SEAL, not as a TACP. Like, this is who I am, why I act the way I do, why I have these issues, and why I also have these good attributes. And
it's getting to the bottom of the whiteboard.
Yeah.
But you're exactly right. And some veterans, by the way, this is not just veterans. I think probably a lot of civilians, like there's probably a narrative conversation to have with everyone.
For sure.
But I'm just focusing on veterans here. But, much like purpose, what we're saying out loud is, hey, this one is not up for discussion either. Your narrative is going to change when you get out of the military. And no one is going to write it for you. You have to do it. But we're going to tell you how to do it. We're going to get you to the bottom of your own board if you're willing to participate in that conversation. And in our curriculum, we actually have space to write where we go, write your narrative and then step away from it and assume it's wrong and then come back and rewrite it and do that 5 times. And by the 5th time, and after you've discussed it with your battle buddy, like maybe then you're getting closer. But it's also going to change. Yeah. But if you know how to write it, then as it changes, you'll stay ahead of it and you'll have confidence in it, right?
Yeah, that work is really tough.
Yeah.
And so I think what's cool is doing it as a community.
Yep.
Of knowing, of guys, I mean, you got some of the hardest individuals in there, but like doing that work right there of writing it down and then rewriting it by the third time, it's like, oh my gosh.
And then saying it out loud with a group of other people.
Yeah.
Class is in session right now, quite literally. Tomorrow morning we meet on the beach at 7 a.m. Last weekend it was purpose. That was our discussion. We have 15 veterans sitting on the beach. And it's hard to get the juices flowing at first, right? And so, but I know some of these guys already, and I told them, I'm like, hey guys, in case you're not aware or willing to say it, we're all weirdos. We're all crazy. Let's just get that out on the beach right now and start having these conversations. And I'll tell you some of my purpose, right? And then I would ask someone else and say, Joe, I know you're weird, and I know you're struggling, dude. So why don't you just be comfortable and say it out loud? And after the first guy says, fuck it, man, and he says it, dude, the gloves are off.
Usually only takes one.
And then everyone else, and you can tell because you start the conversations and people are like rocked back in their chair. They got their arms crossed. You can kind of read body language, but 30 minutes into it, people are like cutting each other off to be next. They're like, I want to tell you how my life is sideways right now, but I have a purpose in what I want to do with it. And I'm like, dude, this is great, and this week tomorrow we're going to be discussing narrative, but the third part of it, the third pillar, it's community. And the thing about serving in the military is you spend an inordinate amount of time around people who are just like you. And the more specialized your career is, the more prevalent this is.
Yep.
You go into a military organization, if you're in special operations, you're in a fighter squadron, fighter pilots or other specialized units, really prevalent. And I do some speaking at military organizations now, and I like to point out to them, even now in the military is really diverse compared to what it used to be, right? Mm-hmm. But really diverse in the military is still not actually diverse. But even if they believe it is, I walk in and I go, hey, look around the room right now. 75% of the people in a room with you are 75% your age. They make 75% the same money. They have 75% the same job. You drive 75% the same cars, do 75% the same workouts, 75% the same music. Your spouses look 75% the same, okay? You're all the same. And it actually has to be that way because in the military, you move every 2 to 4 years. New organization, new base, new country. And everybody has to be 75% the same. So when you get somewhere new in a short amount of time, you can get up to speed, assimilate, and get right to work. If everybody were only 25% the same, you'd be in this perpetual state of storming. Nothing would ever get done in the military because people wouldn't be enough alike each other. Okay. The problem with that is, for a lot of military people, you get out after 20 years and you haven't had to try to make a friend since you were in high school, because everywhere you show up, everybody's just like you. We got the same tattoos. We like the same workouts. We like to do the same shit. And we never had to really try hard. And we had the same narrative. And we had the same purpose. Okay? Now, all of a sudden, you're out on your own. Maybe you have purpose and narrative problem going on at the same time, which makes it even more challenging. And you have to figure out, what community do I want to be a part of? And when you identify that, you have to actually try to be a part of it. You can't just show up and people know who you are in advance. They go, oh, dude, you came from that unit, that base. We know all about you. We read your bio in advance. People don't know anything about you. And if you don't try, why would they? And you have to try. You have to go out of your way. You have to find that community. You have to try to be a part of it. You have to try to assimilate. But for people who have never done that in their life, man, that's hard.
It's difficult.
It's difficult to do for a whole variety of reasons, okay? Some veterans say, I don't feel like explaining myself to people, okay? And if you go to a place like we live, this is actually not a really veteran-heavy town.
No.
Okay? It would be easy if I said, like, dude, my kids play on sports and none of the other parents are prior military, okay? Like, in my case, like, I'm not a total idiot. I know, dude, you don't sit in the bleachers and talk about Ramadi. Okay, this is not an appropriate conversation to have.
I would personally love that.
Yeah, but you get the point,
I'm not the
right?
normal.
Well, I think I'm sorry, I don't want to cut you off real quick, but that brings a good point, because I'll tell you, like, this is the issue I had when I got out, and I had obviously an exceptional story, but let us take that out. You know, the whole story, trial, all that. Even when I showed up here, I was trying to assimilate. Obviously, there's barely any military here compared to where I came from, San Diego.
Yep.
And there's no SEALs. Like, I'm on my own,
Yep.
right? Which was fine. But what I had a hard time doing is I would show up to my kids' soccer games or, you know, whatever other events they were having. And like you said, nobody's really military, that's fine. But what I didn't like, and, you know, I would end up trying to talk to individuals, as soon as they find out you're a SEAL, they automatically assume all these things about you, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, there's that narrative. When that, I'm pretty sure I'm not the only veteran or team guy that feels this way, is it's like, dude, you don't even know me.
Yeah.
Right? You're already like, oh, you're a SEAL, so you're this and this and this. And it's like, that's not who I am.
And they never will if you don't make the effort.
Exactly. But then I can see, because I'm guilty of it, that's where the conversation would end for me. I'm like, I don't want to talk to you because you've already assumed who I am as a person just because I had this prior job. And it's a very uncomfortable place to be in, to be like, well, should I open up to this person or should I not? You know what I mean? And that is a huge leap to take for guys.
The risk with community, if people do not feel compelled to have those conversations, they can feel isolated.
Yeah. And which is what most guys do. And if they're isolating while they're having a purpose or a narrative problem, man, this is a bad place to be. Okay. And so we work with them on that, and we talk to them about that too, and say, this is also not up for discussion. Your community is going to change when you get out of the military. Okay. You might retire out of the same base you were stationed at, and you know your neighbors and things like that, but man, your community is going to change, and you have to work hard to be a part of it now, because you won't have as much in common with other people as you used to. You won't have that narrative as they have as well.
I love that you hit on each one of them, that you tell them the truth right up front. Hey, you're never going to hit the needle.
Yep.
You're never going to go all the way. Your purpose is you can get it in the middle, but like it's never going to get to that place where you were.
Yep.
And then it also, I think with the community part, I mean, I imagine some is you come out of kicking down doors and killing the enemy, and then you're at a soccer game and dads are talking together or whatever, and they're like, "Oh, did you?" They're talking about weather and stuff like, and you're just like,
oh, lost. You're like, that's how I felt. You're like, I would make friends with, certain individuals, and I mean, we're still all friends to this day. But at the beginning, I was like, I have nothing in common. Like, you're talking about real estate, and you're talking about this and this, and I'm like, dude,
So some of that is not the way the experiences that like the GWAT generation had. They are actually not normal. Okay, I think somebody's probably going to do a lot of research on this in the future because there's still a lot of GWAT guys that are serving today. There still will be. It'll take another 10 years until
GWAT?
Global War on Terrorism, guys that were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. Guys who are doing a deployment every year for 2, 4, 6, 20
decades.
Years.
Yeah.
Okay. When this is part of why we spend time in the ocean, okay? I'll tell you. And I mentioned this a little earlier, I'm finally getting around to it now. When you move every 2 to 4 years, your entire adult life, it sets a sort of rhythm in your life. You show up somewhere new and you spend the first 6 months in receive only mode, learning your job. I don't know anything. I'm going to ask a ton of questions and just be a good teammate and row the boat. Okay. And then for a year in the middle, I'm going to hammer down and do the best at everything I can. And then in the last 6 months, you take your foot off the gas because you're leaving. You need to start looking at the next base, figuring out what schools your kids are going to go to, where your wife is going to work, what kind of house you're going to buy, all this stuff. And you do this over and over and over again. On the combat side, you deploy for 4 months. And before you even get home, you already know all the training events you have to go on, and you know they're going to suck, so you're not even looking forward to going home. And then as soon as you get home, you already mark the calendar on when you're leaving again.
Yep. You're already thinking about what you're doing next.
Everything you do is based off of when you're leaving. Years of your life where people go, hey, can you come to this event? It's in March. And you're like, March? Dude, I don't know what I'm doing in 2 weeks. Like, I can't commit to something in March. Maybe my wife can. If I'm here, I'm there. But I can't commit, okay? When you spend decades of your life, like, non-committal, not to your own fault, and always thinking about moving, then you retire one day. It's not uncommon. We talk about this too, where people go, dude, when I retire, I'm never moving again. I'm going to build a house and I'm going to live in it forever.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, 18 months later, they go,
you got the itch.
Why am I looking on Zillow? Why am I thinking about where I'm going to move? Why am I thinking about what else is out there?
I need to get out of here.
I need to get out of here. And we go, it's because you've moved, because every 18 months for the last 20 years, you think about leaving. That is like our daily circadian rhythm. You know what time you go to bed, you know what time you get tired. Okay? It's really hard to adjust that, especially as you get older. Well, veterans have this sort of this longer term circadian rhythm where they're always expecting to move. It's why some guys don't do well staying in one place, okay? Some guys say, I love to go and sit on mountains because mountains don't move, okay? And there's some truth to that. But a lot of other people say, I don't like being in the mountains because they don't move. I feel like nothing is happening around me. And in the research that led into starting Surf Brigade, that's why we spend time in the ocean. And that's why actually the ocean, a lot of people can't explain this, but I'm going to tell you why a lot of people feel called to the ocean. Maybe they just want to walk up to the edge of it and stand there, or they just want to go look at it. Okay. Ideally, they want to get in it, and it's because it's always moving. The ocean, you're moving three-dimensionally. The current is pushing you one way, the waves are pushing you another, and the wind in a third way. And for veterans who spent their entire lives in constant motion, the ocean can actually be a very comforting place because it's always moving as well. Now, the fascinating part about it is you have to be comfortable giving up a little bit of control to the ocean if you want to surf, okay? You can't move waves. You can't control which way they go, okay? You can control, though, however, if you're going to take them over the head, based on where you are in the lineup. You can control if you're going to get destroyed by one or you're going to stand up and ride it. That's on you. Okay? That's why we spend so much time in the ocean, and we try to help veterans understand, like, man, for people who moved their entire adult life, sometimes not moving at all isn't the answer. Come spend time in the water. Let it move you around and enjoy it. It might feel comforting to you. But these are the three areas: purpose, narrative, and community. And that's why we focus on them. And you know, through it, by the way, on day one, everybody counts off and we go, the person to your left is your battle buddy. And they have to check in throughout the week in between Saturday surf sessions and have conversations about purpose, narrative, and community. Good. And when we're done, and you guys have come out to this too, when we're done, we have a bonfire ceremony right here in Santa Rosa Beach because we can have fires here. And we invite everyone out, and for the first time, they all bring their families, and so everybody can meet each other there as well. And we tell them, like a military-style graduation. We have certificates, and we go, hey, dude, you made a commitment to Surf Brigade. You made a commitment to yourself. You made a commitment to your battle buddies. You showed up. You wiped out. You took waves over the head. You had hard conversations about things that really matter.